welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere warm and far away, out into a great, quiet desert in the south of Africa, to a little town that the sand is slowly carrying away. It's called Kolmanskop. There's a whole story here of diamonds and dreams and a town that rose up out of nothing and then gently let itself go. I'll tell it to you slowly, from the very beginning. So get comfortable, settle in. You don't have to stay awake for any of it. I'll keep going. Chapter 1. The Desert Before the Town. Let's begin long before anyone built anything here, out in the open desert, where for a very long time there was nothing at all but sand and wind and light. In the far southwest of Africa, along the coast of what we now call Namibia, there is one of the oldest and driest deserts in the world. It's called the Namib, and it is a vast and astonishing place, a sea of sand and gravel and bare rock stretching for hundreds of miles, running right down to where the cold grey Atlantic Ocean breaks against the shore. The Namib has been a desert for a very, very long time, far longer than most deserts on Earth. Tens of millions of years of dryness, so that everything that lives here has had to learn over the ages to live with almost no water at all. It is not an empty place, though it can look empty at first. It only seems empty until your eyes adjust to its particular kind of life. There are beetles here that have learned to drink the fog, standing on the dune crests in the early morning with their backs tilted up so that the mist from the sea collects on them and runs down to their mouths. There are little geckos with webbed feet for running over soft sand. There are plants that can wait years for rain, holding still, holding on. And there is the wind. Always the wind, coming in off the ocean and sweeping across the dunes, lifting the sand and carrying it and setting it down again somewhere else, endlessly reshaping the land, grain by grain, day after day, year after year. The dunes of the Namib are some of the tallest in the world, great slow mountains of sand, soft red and orange and gold, with sharp curved crests that the wind sculpts and resculpts. They are always moving, though far too slowly for the eye to see. A dune is not really a thing so much as a process. A great heap of sand always travelling, always being pushed along by the prevailing wind, so that, over the years, a whole dune can creep forward across the desert floor, swallowing whatever lies in its path, and then, in time, uncovering it again on the far side. The desert here is patient like that. It has all the time in the world. It is in no hurry to do anything, and it cannot be hurried. The coast itself, where the desert meets the sea, is a wild and lonely shore. The cold Atlantic current that runs along it makes the water frigid even under the African sun, and the meeting of cold sea and hot land breeds thick banks of fog that roll in over the dunes in the early morning and then burn off as the day warms. Sailors feared this coast for centuries. So many ships were wrecked along it, run aground in the fog, or driven onto the hidden sandbars, that part of it earned a grim and famous name, the Skeleton Coast, for the bones of the ships and the sailors that the desert kept. To come ashore here from a wreck was often only the beginning of the trouble, because behind the beach lay nothing but waterless desert for as far as a person could walk. So this was the land before the town. Hot, dry, ancient, beautiful, and almost entirely without people. The native peoples of the region, the Nama and others, knew the desert and its edges, and moved through it with knowledge gathered over countless generations. But even they did not try to live out in the deep sand, where there was no water and nothing to eat. It was a place you crossed, carefully, knowing what you were doing, not a place you settled. For thousands of years, the dunes simply rolled along the coast. The fog came in each morning and burned off each noon. The wind blew, the sand travelled, and almost no one was there to see any of it. It's a peaceful picture in its enormous, empty way. Just the desert and the sea and the sky, and the slow breathing of the dunes. Hold on to it for a little while, because soon enough people are going to come pouring into this empty corner of the world in a great sudden rush, chasing something small and bright and hidden in the sand. But for now, before any of that, let the desert simply be what it had always been. Vast, quiet, golden, asleep in the sun. Let me linger here a moment longer in the desert before the town, because there is a particular kind of peace in a place this empty, and it's worth resting in. Think about how the days passed here with no one to count them. In the deep night, the desert grew cold, far colder than you might expect of a place so hot by day, the heat of the afternoon escaping up into the clear, dry air until the sand was chill to the touch and the stars came out in their tremendous numbers, undimmed by any light for hundreds of miles. Then the first grey of dawn, and very often the fog creeping in silent off the cold sea, filling the low places between the dunes, softening everything, beading on the few hardy plants, giving the desert creatures their daily drink. And then the sun, climbing, and the fog thinning and lifting and vanishing, and the heat returning, and the colours coming back, the reds and the golds and the bone whites, the long blue shadows shortening as the sun rose higher, until the desert lay flooded with light and shimmering with heat through the long middle of the day. And the wind, through all of it, doing its slow, patient work. There is a sound the wind makes on the great dunes, a low, soft hiss as it lifts the grains and rolls them up the windward slope and over the crest. A sound like the desert breathing, or like distant water, or like nothing else at all. The dunes themselves moved to that sound, so slowly that no eye could catch it, travelling across the desert floor over the years, advancing and retreating, swallowing and uncovering, rearranging the whole vast landscape with infinite patience. Nothing here was ever quite finished. Nothing was ever quite still. But it all moved so slowly and so quietly that the overwhelming feeling of the place was one of deep and ancient peace, a stillness so large it could hold all that slow motion inside it without ever being disturbed. For thousands upon thousands of years, that was the desert. That was all of it. The cold nights and the foggy dawns and the blazing noons and the red evenings. The wheeling stars and the breathing dunes and the endless, patient wind. No towns, no names, no history. Just the desert, being the desert, the way it had been since long before there was anyone to give it a name. Content and complete and entirely at rest. It's a good thing to hold in your mind as you begin to relax. A place so old and so calm that nothing could trouble it, where the only movement was the slow drift of sand and the only sound was the soft sigh of the wind. There's nothing to worry about there. There's nothing happening that needs your attention. There's just the great, quiet desert, golden and asleep, the way you're drifting towards sleep now. Because here is the thing that nobody knew yet, the secret the desert had been keeping all those millions of years. Scattered through the sand of this lonely coast, tumbled and polished and carried by the same wind and water that shaped everything else here, were diamonds. Not buried deep, not hidden in rock that would have to be blasted and dug, just lying there, loose in the sand, in places so thick that a person who knew what to look for could pick them up by hand in the moonlight. The desert had been gathering them and sorting them and laying them out for ages, and it had told no one. And when, at last, someone happened to notice, everything about this quiet place was going to change, almost overnight. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, and we have all night. Let's not rush. Let the diamonds stay hidden in the sand a little longer. Let the desert keep its secret one more evening. We'll come to the day it was found soon enough. Chapter 2. A Stone in the Sand. Our story really begins with a railway and a man shoveling sand. In the early years of the 20th century, this corner of southwest Africa was a German colony. The European powers of that age had divided up much of Africa among themselves, drawing lines on maps over land they barely knew, and this stretch of desert coast had fallen to Germany. The Germans had established a small port town on the coast called Lüderitz, a hard little outpost of stone and timber clinging to the edge of the continent, with the cold sea in front of it and the endless desert behind. From Lüderitz, they were slowly pushing a railway line inland, across the sand, to connect the coast to the interior. The railway is where so much of this begins, so let's sit with it in a moment. A railway is a hopeful thing in its way, a line reaching out across empty country towards some imagined future, towards trade and settlement and connection. The Germans were building theirs across the desert to link their lonely port with the lands beyond, a slow and difficult project in a place that fought them every step of the way. For the desert did not want a railway. The desert wanted, as it always wants, only to move its sand around, and a railway line laid across the path of the moving sand is simply another thing for the sand to bury. So the work was endless. No sooner was a stretch of track laid and cleared than the wind would blow and the sand would drift across it again, and the crews would have to come back and dig it out, over and over, a labour with no real end, like sweeping back the sea. Building a railway across a desert of moving sand is a frustrating business. The wind never stops, and it is forever blowing sand across the tracks, burying them, so that crews had to be kept constantly at work shoveling the line clear. It was hot, hard, repetitive labour under a fierce sun, and most of it was done by local African workers, men whose names history has mostly failed to record, doing the heavy and thankless work that made the colony run. One of these workers was a man named Zacharias Lewala. He had worked before at the diamond fields far to the south in South Africa, and so, unlike most of the people around him, he had actually seen rough diamonds before, had handled them, knew the particular way they catch and hold the light. And one day in 1908, while he was shoveling sand away from the railway tracks near a spot in the desert, he noticed a small stone gleaming among the grains. He picked it up. There was something about it. He recognized that shine. Zacharias took the stone to his supervisor, a German railway inspector named August Stauch. Now, Stauch was an unusual man for that place and time, because he had become quietly fascinated by the idea that there might be valuable minerals in this desert, and he had actually instructed his workers to keep an eye out for any interesting stones they turned up. So when Zacharias brought him the little gleaming pebble, Stauch did not brush it off. He looked at it closely. He tested it, scratching it against glass, and it cut the glass cleanly, the way only a very hard stone can. He began to suspect what he was holding. It is a small moment when you stand back and look at it, and yet everything turns on it. A man stooping over a railway line, noticing a glint. Another man, unusual in his curiosity, choosing to take the glint seriously rather than tossing it aside. So much of history hinges on small moments like that, on someone bothering to look closely at a thing that others would have ignored. Had Stauch been an ordinary supervisor, uninterested in the rocks of the desert, he might have waved the stone away, and the diamond fields might have stayed hidden a while longer, or been found by someone else, or found in some other way entirely, and the whole story of Kolmanskop might never have happened, or happened quite differently. But he was who he was, curious and alert, and he had told his men to watch for stones. And so when the stone came, he was ready to recognize what it might be. The little town in the sand, with all its ice and music and improbable life, traces all the way back to that one moment of attention, that one man choosing to look closely at a pebble a worker had found in the sand. He sent it away to be examined by an expert, and the answer came back. And it was the answer that would change everything. It was a diamond, a real one. And here is the part that made this place extraordinary. When August Stauck and the others went back out into the desert and really started looking, on their hands and knees in the sand, they found that the diamonds were not rare here at all. They were everywhere. The ground was scattered with them. In some places, the stones lay so thick on the surface that you could crawl along and gather them by the handful. There are stories, and they appear to be largely true, of men going out on bright moonlit nights, when the diamonds caught the moonlight and glittered against the dark sand, and simply crawling across the desert floor picking them up, filling tins and jars and their own mouths with diamonds, more in a single night than most people would ever see in a lifetime. Imagine the feeling of it. This empty, worthless-seeming stretch of desert, this hard place where men had been doing nothing but shoveling sand off a railway, turned out to be sitting on one of the richest diamond deposits anyone had ever found. Word got out, as word always does, and it spread like fire. A diamond rush was coming. There is something almost dizzying in the suddenness of it. One day this is a stretch of nothing, a hardship posting, a place where the great event of the week is keeping the sand off the rails. And then a single small stone changes everything. And within months, the same desert is one of the most valuable patches of ground on the face of the earth. Fortunes were made almost overnight. August Stauck, the railway inspector who had told his workers to keep an eye out, became a wealthy man, very wealthy, on the strength of that gleaming pebble and the claims he was clever enough to stake. Others rushed in behind, hungry for their share. The quiet desert filled up, almost in an instant, with prospectors and companies and officials and dreams of sudden riches. All of it set off by Zacharias Lawala, bending down to pick up a shining stone while he worked. It's worth holding on to his name, Zacharias Lawala, because history so often forgets the people at the bottom of these stories, the workers whose hands actually touched the thing that changed everything. He found the diamond. He recognized it. He carried it to his supervisor. And yet the wealth that flowed out of that moment flowed, for the most part, to others, to the company men and the colonial authorities and the clever Europeans who knew how to turn a discovery into a fortune. That, too, is part of the truth of this place, woven in right from the very first stone. But the finding itself, the human moment of it, the sharp-eyed man noticing a glint in the sand he was paid only to shovel, belongs to him. The German colonial authorities moved fast to control it. They drew a line around a huge stretch of the desert, hundreds of miles of it, and declared the whole area a forbidden zone, the Sperrgebiet, which simply means the forbidden territory in German. Inside the Sperrgebiet, no one could enter, prospect, or dig without permission from the authorities and the companies they favoured. It was sealed off, restricted, guarded. The diamonds were too valuable and too easy to simply pick up, to let just anyone come and take them. And so, this corner of the desert became, almost in a single stroke, both fabulously rich and strictly forbidden. A place where unimaginable wealth lay loose on the ground, behind a line that ordinary people were not allowed to cross. And right out there, in the middle of the newly discovered diamond fields, near where that first stone had gleamed in the sand, a town began to rise. A real town, a proper one, built quickly and built well to house the people who would gather the desert's hidden fortune. They called it Kolmanskop. Let's go there now, in its first days, and watch it being built, brick by brick, out in the sand. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Coast. Before we walk through the streets of the town itself, let me tell you a little more about the strange and lonely world it was born into, because the setting of Kolmanskop is as much a part of its story as the diamonds, and it's a setting worth resting in for a while. This whole stretch of coast, where the Namib Desert runs down to meet the cold Atlantic, is one of the most remote and forbidding shorelines anywhere on Earth. The sea here is cold, far colder than you would expect this close to the equator, because of a great current that sweeps up from the deep south, carrying chill water along the African coast. That cold sea, meeting the hot desert air, breeds the fog that we keep returning to, the thick banks of mist that roll in over the dunes and can swallow a ship whole. And the coast itself is treacherous, lined with hidden sandbars and rocks and shifting shallows, with few safe harbours and fewer landmarks, so that for centuries sailors dreaded it. To the north of where our story takes place, this shore earned its grim and famous name, the Skeleton Coast. It was called that for the bones of the countless ships wrecked along it over the centuries, their rusting hulls still scattered along the sand to this day, and the bones, too, of the sailors and whales and other creatures the coast claimed. To be wrecked on the Skeleton Coast was a double disaster, because surviving the sea was only the beginning. A sailor who made it to shore found himself on a narrow beach with the cold ocean behind him, and in front of him hundreds of miles of waterless desert in every direction. Many who survived their shipwrecks died anyway, on the sand, walking inland in search of water that was not there. It is a coast that has kept a great many secrets and a great many lives. And yet it was here, on this hard and lonely shore, that the Germans had planted their little port of Lüderitz, and from here that they pushed their railway inland across the sand, and here, near that railway, that the diamonds were found. So Kolmanskop was born in one of the most inhospitable corners of the world, a place of cold fog and killing desert, and a coast named for skeletons. It is part of what makes the town's brief glory so astonishing, that anyone managed to build a place of pianos and ice and swimming pools in such a setting at all. When the diamonds were found, and the authorities sealed off the region as the Sperrgebiet, the Forbidden Territory, they were drawing a line around an enormous stretch of this desert coast, an area far larger than the diamond fields themselves, hundreds of miles of it, declaring the whole of it off limits. Inside that line, ordinary people could not go. They could not prospect, could not travel, could not even enter without permission. It was patrolled and guarded, and the penalties for slipping in to hunt for diamonds were severe. The idea was total control, to make sure that every diamond that came out of the desert came out through the proper hands, and that none of the loose fortune lying in the sand was carried off by anyone unauthorized. And here is something quietly remarkable. Much of that forbidden zone has remained forbidden ever since, for well over 100 years now. Because so much of this coast was sealed off and kept empty of people for so long, it became, almost by accident, one of the least disturbed stretches of desert and coastline anywhere on Earth. The very greed that closed it off also protected it, kept the roads and the towns and the crowds out, left the dunes and the wildlife and the wild shore very much as they had always been. There are parts of this coast that almost no living person has set foot on in a century, not because they are dangerous, though they are, but simply because they have been forbidden, locked away behind the line drawn to guard the diamonds. It is a strange thought that a place can be preserved by being forbidden, kept wild and pristine precisely because no one was allowed in. But that is what happened along this coast, and it is part of the deep stillness that hangs over the whole region to this day. It's a pattern you find in more places than you might expect, this accidental preservation, this wildness protected by a fence and a prohibition. Land that is locked away for one reason, money or secrecy or danger, often ends up sheltering, behind its barriers, a peace and a wildness that the busy world outside has lost everywhere else. The line on the map says "keep out," and the deserts and the animals and the silence quietly flourish in the space the people are kept away from. Along this coast, the diamonds drew the line, and behind it, for over a century, the old desert simply went on being itself, undisturbed, the dunes travelling, the fog rolling in, the wild creatures living their lives, the whole vast, quiet place left almost exactly as it had always been, guarded, in a way, by the very wealth that might otherwise have torn it apart. The Forbidden Zone became, without anyone quite intending it, one of the great accidental sanctuaries of stillness on the earth. So that was the world Kolmanskop was born into. A forbidden coast, a sealed desert, a place of fog and skeletons and loose diamonds and locked gates, beautiful and harsh and utterly remote. And in the middle of it, against all of that, the people built their bright little town. Let's go and walk through it now, in its first days, and see what they made. Chapter 4. A Town Built on Diamonds. The name Kolmanskop comes from an earlier, humbler story. Before the diamonds, a transport driver named Johnny Coleman is said to have been caught out here in a sandstorm and to have abandoned his ox wagon on a small rise in the desert. People began calling that spot Coleman's Hill, which in the language of the German colonists became Kolmanskop, and in the local Afrikaans became Kolmanskop. A driver, a lost wagon, a low hill in the sand. That was all the place was before the diamonds. A name attached to a spot where a man had once had a bad day. But after the diamonds, Kolmanskop became something no one could have imagined. With money pouring in from the diamond fields, the company that ran them built, out here in the middle of one of the driest deserts on Earth, a town of astonishing comfort and even luxury. And they built it in the German style, because these were German colonists who wanted, as colonists so often did, to recreate the home they had left behind, right down to the smallest details, as if they could plant a piece of Germany in the African sand and make it grow. So picture what rose up out of the dunes. Solid, handsome houses with steep roofs and shuttered windows and verandas. The kind of houses you might find in a small German town, now standing in rows on the desert sand. Grander homes for the managers and the doctor and the important men, with fine furniture shipped all the way from Europe, with pianos and chandeliers and wallpaper and paintings. A whole built world of European comfort, set down incongruously in the middle of the Namib. And it was not just houses. This is the part that astonishes people most. Kolmanskop, this small town in a waterless desert, had things that most towns far larger and far better placed did not have in those years. It had a power station, so the town had electricity early, when much of the world still lived by lamplight. It had a hospital, and that hospital had the first X-ray machine in the whole of the southern hemisphere. Partly to care for the sick, and partly, it said, to check whether workers were trying to smuggle out swallowed diamonds. It had an ice factory, so that in the searing desert heat, every household could be delivered a block of ice each day to keep their food cold and their drinks cool. Think of that. Daily ice in the Namib Desert over 100 years ago. Each of these was, in its own way, a small marvel. Take the electricity. In the early decades of the 20th century, electric light was still a novelty in much of the world. Whole cities, whole countries still ran largely on gas and oil and candles. And here, in the middle of the most remote desert imaginable, a little town glowed with electric light each night, its power station humming away, its streets and houses and grand hall lit up bright against the desert dark. From a distance, at night, Kolmanskop must have been an astonishing sight, an island of electric light floating in an ocean of black desert, visible for miles, a little constellation come down to earth. Or take that hospital and its X-ray machine, the first in the entire southern half of the world. Think of what that means. A medical technology so new and so rare that no other hospital in all of southern Africa, in all the vast lands south of the equator, possessed one. And yet here it was, installed in a tiny diamond town in the desert, because the diamonds could pay for it, and because the company wanted it, both to keep its people healthy and, in that less generous use, to peer inside the workers and make sure none of them were carrying off swallowed stones. It is a perfect little emblem of the whole place, that X-ray machine. Cutting-edge wealth and comfort and care, shot through with control and suspicion, all of it improbably present in the middle of nowhere because of the diamonds in the sand and the ice. Perhaps nothing captures the strange luxury of Kolmanskop better than the daily ice. In a desert where the temperature could climb to punishing heights, where there was almost no water, where everything had to be hauled in from far away, the town nonetheless manufactured ice every day and delivered it to every household so that the people of Kolmanskop could keep their food fresh and their drinks cold as casually as if they lived in a temperate European city rather than one of the hottest, driest places on earth. The ice cart making its rounds each morning was the daily proof of the town's improbable wealth, a small, cold miracle repeated every single day, made possible entirely by the bright stones in the sand. There was a grand hall, a place for concerts and plays and dances and gatherings, with a stage and a sprung floor for dancing. Performers and musicians were brought all the way from Europe to entertain the town. There was a school for the children. There was a bowling alley, the first in this part of the world. There were shops, a bakery, a butcher, a place to buy furniture, a soda and lemonade factory. There was even, remarkably, a swimming pool, filled with water in the middle of the desert, and a casino, and beautifully kept gardens that the residents fought to grow against the constant sand and drought. Linger on the swimming pool for a moment, because it is almost the perfect symbol of the whole improbable place. A swimming pool is a thing of pure leisure, a luxury even in places with water to spare. And here it was, in one of the driest deserts on earth, a pool full of clear water, every drop of it carried in from far away at great cost, simply so that the people of Kolmanskop could swim and splash and cool themselves in the desert heat. Children learning to swim in the middle of the Namib, adults floating on their backs under the enormous blue sky, the dunes rolling away beyond the pool's edge for 100 waterless miles. It is almost absurd and almost magnificent, this pool of cool water held against all the logic of the desert, made possible by nothing but the diamonds and the will to enjoy them. And the gardens, too, tell the same story of stubborn human determination. The desert wanted nothing to grow. The sand wanted to bury every green thing. The dryness wanted to wither it. And yet the people of Kolmanskop coaxed gardens into being, watering them by hand with precious imported water, sheltering them from the wind, digging them out when the sand crept in, growing flowers and shrubs and small trees in a place that had never known them. Those gardens, like the pool and the ice and the music, were a daily act of will, a refusal to simply submit to the harshness of the setting, a determination to live not merely survivably, but beautifully, in the heart of one of the world's great wildernesses. It could not last. But while it lasted, it was a small marvel of human stubbornness and hope. Picture for a moment what it took to make all of that real out here. Every brick of every building had to be made or brought in. Every beam of wood, in a place with not a single tree worth the name, had to be carried across the desert. The pianos, the chandeliers, the fine furniture, the china and the crystal and the wine, all of it shipped across the sea to Lüderitz and then hauled inland by rail to this spot in the sand. The machinery for the power station, the great apparatus of the ice factory, the equipment for the hospital, all of it transported at enormous effort and expense to a town that, only a few years before, had not existed at all. The people of Kolmanskop willed a piece of Europe into being in the desert through sheer determination and an almost bottomless supply of diamond money. And the result was a town that, for its brief life, was more comfortable and better equipped than places 10 times its size and 100 times its age. And they did it, remember, in a place with essentially no water. That is the detail that should never quite leave your mind as you picture Kolmanskop in its glory. The swimming pool, the daily ice, the gardens, the lemonade, the very drinking water. None of it came from the desert, because the desert had none to give. It was all carried in from far away, drop by precious drop. An entire town's worth of water hauled across the sand because the diamonds made it possible. There is something almost defiant about it. A town that flaunted ice and swimming pools and green gardens in the face of one of the driest deserts on earth. Simply because it could. Simply because the stones in the sand had made its people rich enough to spit in the eye of the desert for a while. The desert, of course, would have the last word. But for those years, the town won. Daily, gloriously, improbably. And water, of course, was the great challenge, because there was almost none. The town had no real water of its own. Fresh water had to be brought in, at first hauled by ship and rail across great distances, and later piped from far away. Every drop that filled the swimming pool and watered the gardens and made the daily ice had to be carried into the desert from somewhere else, at great cost. But the diamonds paid for it. The diamonds paid for everything. When you are gathering one of the richest fortunes on earth up off the ground, the cost of shipping in water and ice and pianos and opera singers simply does not matter very much. So that was Kolmanskop in its glory. A little jewel box of a town, a transplanted scrap of Europe, sparkling with electric light in the middle of the great silent desert, where the wind blew sand against the walls of houses full of chandeliers and fine china, and the people who lived there enjoyed comforts that most of the world could only dream of. All of it paid for by the small, bright stones that lay scattered in the sand all around them. It must have felt, to the people who lived there, like a kind of dream, or perhaps like a strange and wonderful accident, this pocket of luxury blooming in the most unlikely place imaginable. And for a while, for a couple of glittering decades, the dream held. Let's stay in it a while, in the good years, and see what life was like in a diamond town in the desert. But before we step into those everyday lives, hold the whole improbable picture in your mind for a moment, because it is worth marvelling at. Here is one of the oldest, driest, emptiest deserts on the face of the earth, a place where for millions of years there was nothing but sand and wind and fog and the occasional fog-drinking beetle. And here, set down in the middle of it, almost overnight, is a little town that would not have looked out of place in the green hills of Germany. White houses with steep tiled roofs, lace curtains in the windows, a piano in the parlour, a garden with actual flowers, watered by hand against the desert, a great hall where an orchestra plays, a swimming pool sparkling under the desert sun, children in school uniforms, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery in the morning, the chime of the ice cart, the hum of the power station, the whole busy apparatus of a comfortable European life, running smoothly in a place that, by every natural law, should not have been able to support a single person. It was a kind of magnificent defiance, Kolmanskop, a thumbing of the nose at the desert, made possible entirely by the small, bright stones in the sand. And like all such defiances, it was temporary, though no one wanted to think about that while the diamonds lasted and the music played. For now, the dream held. For now, the lights were on and the ice was cold, and the desert was kept politely outside the door. Let's go in and live in the good years a while. There's a tenderness, looking back, in how completely the people of Kolmanskop believed in their town, how they built it not as a temporary camp, but as a permanent home, with all the care and craft and hope that implies. They did not put up rough shacks to be torn down when the diamonds ran out. They built solid, handsome houses meant to last for generations. They planted gardens that would take years to mature. They installed a grand hall and a school and a hospital, the institutions of a town that means to endure. They were not thinking, as they built, about the day the diamonds would thin and the people would leave and the sand would come pouring in. They were thinking about the future, their children's future, here, in this bright, improbable place they were willing into being in the sand. That the future turned out so differently, that the whole thing lasted only a few decades, does not make their hope foolish. It only makes it human and a little poignant, the way all our building and planning is poignant, set as it always is against a future we cannot see. They built for forever and got a few golden decades, and those decades were real and good. Let's go and live in them now. Chapter 5. The Work of the Diamonds. Before we settle into the everyday life of the town, let me tell you a little more about the strange and almost magical work that paid for all of it, because the way the diamonds were gathered here was unlike mining almost anywhere else on Earth, and it helps explain how such a place could exist at all. In most of the world, getting diamonds is brutally hard. You dig enormous pits, or you sink deep shafts into solid rock, and you crush and process unimaginable tonnages of stone to find a few small gems. It is dangerous, expensive, and slow. But at Kolmanskop, in the early years especially, none of that was necessary, because the desert had already done the hard part. Over millions of years, the diamonds had been carried here, washed down ancient rivers, and tumbled along the coast, and then scattered across the desert and sorted by the wind and the water, until they lay loose in the sand near the surface, waiting. The work was not to dig them out of the deep earth. The work was simply to find them and pick them up. And in the very richest places in the beginning, finding them was almost absurdly easy. The most famous stories from those first days are about the moonlight. On bright, moonlit nights, it was discovered, the diamonds would catch the light and shine against the dark sand, so that a person crawling along the desert floor could actually see them glittering. And so men went out at night, in the cool, under the enormous desert moon, and crawled across the sand on their hands and knees, gathering diamonds that gleamed in the moonlight, filling containers, filling their hands, sometimes, it is said, filling their mouths, to carry as many as possible. Picture that. A line of figures crawling across the silver desert under the moon, gathering up little points of fire from the sand, in numbers that beggar belief. It sounds like something out of a fable, but it really happened in the early days, here, in this place. Try to really see it, because it is one of the most extraordinary images in the whole history of this kind of work. The desert at night, cool after the blazing day, the sand pale and silver under a full moon, the sky thick with stars, the silence enormous. And across that silver landscape, the gleam of diamonds, hundreds of them, thousands, scattered loose on the surface, each one catching the moonlight and throwing it back as a tiny spark. And the gatherers moving slowly among the sparks, low to the ground, picking them up one after another, a harvest of light. There is something almost dreamlike about it, almost beautiful, however hard the lives of the men doing the gathering may have been, however much the wealth they collected would flow past them into other hands. The earth, just this once, in just this place, had laid out its treasure on the surface and lit it with the moon. And for a brief window of time, before the easy stones were gone, gathering a fortune was as simple as crawling through the cool night, picking up fallen stars. Those days did not last, of course. The surface stones, however many there were finite, and the moonlight harvest gave way within a few years to harder and more systematic work. But the stories of it lingered, and they linger still, part of the legend of this place, the almost unbelievable beginning when the desert simply gave its diamonds up to anyone willing to crawl through the moonlight and gather them. As the easiest stones were gathered, the work grew more systematic, more organised, less like a fairy tale and more like an industry. Large areas were marked out and worked over methodically. The sand was scraped up and sifted and sorted, washed and screened and combed through to separate the diamonds from the ordinary grains. Crews of labourers did this work, the long, patient sorting, day after day under the sun. It was still far easier than tunnelling through rock, but it was hard, hot, monotonous labour all the same. And it was done, as I said and will say again because it matters, mostly by African workers, whose lives were a great deal harder than those of the Europeans whose comfort they were paying for. And running through everything, like a thread of suspicion, was the problem of theft. When the thing you are gathering is small enough to hide in a hand, a pocket, a mouth, a wound, a shoe, and valuable enough to change a life, the people in charge become obsessed with making sure none of it walks away. Workers were watched, searched, controlled. The famous X-ray machine in the hospital, the first in the Southern Hemisphere, was used in part to look inside workers for swallowed stones. There were elaborate systems to prevent smuggling. The whole region, the Sperrgebiet, was sealed and guarded, in large part for this reason, to keep the diamonds inside the fence and in the company's hands. So even in its glory, Kolmanskop had this hard edge to it, this air of control and suspicion, the shadow side of a place where wealth lay loose on the ground, and human nature was exactly what human nature has always been. It is one of the quiet ironies of the place. The diamonds were everywhere, lying in the sand, gathered by the handful, and yet the people who actually did the gathering were trusted with none of them, watched constantly, searched, x-rayed, hemmed in behind a guarded fence, suspected always of trying to keep back a single stone. The very abundance that made the town rich also made it anxious, made it a place of locks and searches and watchful eyes, because the easier a fortune is to pocket, the harder its owners will work to make sure no one pockets it. There is something almost sad in that. In a desert full of diamonds, where the men gathering them had to be searched at the end of every shift, the wealth flowing past their hands and into other pockets, the suspicion lying over everything like the fog over the dunes. The beauty and the comfort of Kolmanskop were real, but so was this, the hard, watchful edge of it, and an honest telling holds both. But the diamonds came, and the money flowed, and the town it built was, for a while, a genuine wonder. So let's turn now to the gentler side of the story, to the ordinary human days of Kolmanskop, in the years when it was full and lively and new. Chapter 6. Life in the Good Years. Let me take you into the ordinary days of Kolmanskop, in the years when it was full and lively and new, because the everyday life of the place is gentler and warmer than you might expect from a town in such a harsh and lonely setting. Morning in Kolmanskop began, as mornings in the desert do, with that soft grey light and often with fog, the sea fog rolling in off the cold Atlantic and drifting over the dunes and the rooftops, so that the town would wake inside a cool, damp cloud. The sand darkened with moisture, the air smelling faintly of salt. Then the sun would climb, and the fog would thin and lift and burn away, and the day would brighten and warm, and the desert colours would come back, the gold of the sand, and the white of the houses, and the deep blue of the sky. There is a particular gentleness to a desert morning that begins in fog, and the people of Kolmanskop woke to it most days of their lives. The fog softened everything: the hard edges of the houses, the brightness of the sand, the great emptiness of the desert beyond the town. For an hour or two each morning, the world was small and close and quiet, wrapped in cool grey mist, the kind of soft, dim light that makes you want to stay in bed a little longer, to linger under the covers in the hush. And then, slowly, the warmth would come, and the light would strengthen, and the fog would lift away like a curtain rising, and there would be the desert again, vast and golden and brilliant, and the day would begin in earnest. To wake each morning to that gentle ritual, the fog and then the light, the hush and then the brightness, must have been one of the quiet pleasures of living here, a soft daily beginning in a hard and beautiful place. The ice cart would make its rounds, delivering to each household its daily block of ice, a small miracle repeated every single morning, hauled out of the ice factory and carried to kitchens all over town to keep the milk and the meat and the butter cool through the heat of the day. Children would be off to the school. The bakery would fill the air with the smell of fresh bread. Housewives would tend their hard-won gardens, watering the few precious plants that they coaxed to grow against all the desert's discouragement, sweeping the ever-present sand off the verandas, fighting the slow, patient war against the sand that every single person in Kolmanskop fought every single day, and mostly, for now, won. That daily war against the sand deserves a moment of its own, because it tells you so much about what it meant to live here. The desert never stopped. Every night the wind blew, and every morning there was sand. Sand on the verandas, sand against the doors, sand sifting in along the windowsills, sand to be swept and shovelled and carried back out. To keep a house in Kolmanskop clean and bright was to do battle, gently and endlessly, with the entire desert. And the people did it, cheerfully enough, because that was simply the price of living in this beautiful, improbable place. They swept, and the sand came back, and they swept again. They planted gardens, and the sand tried to bury them, and they dug them out and planted again. It was a small daily discipline, repeated in every household, a quiet acknowledgement that they were guests here, in the desert's house, allowed to stay only so long as they kept pushing the sand back out the door each morning. The moment they stopped, the moment the people left, the desert would simply walk back in and stay. But for now, every morning, they won the small war, and the houses stayed bright, and life went on. There is a homeliness to all of this that is easy to overlook amid the diamonds and the chandeliers, and it's worth resting in, because it's the warm, beating heart of the place. For all its strangeness, Kolmanskop was, day to day, simply a small town where people lived ordinary lives. A child running late for school, satchel bouncing. The baker up before dawn, his ovens warm, the smell of fresh bread drifting out into the cool morning air. A woman pausing in her garden with a watering can to exchange a few words with a neighbour over the fence. The clink of the ice being delivered, the small, daily transactions of a community that knew itself, where everyone recognised everyone, where the rhythms of the day were shared by all. These are the textures of home anywhere in the world, in any age, and they were here too, in this most unlikely of places, woven through the diamonds and the desert. People got up and made breakfast, and went about their days and came home, and it was all, to them, simply life, simply ordinary, simply home. And there is something deeply soothing in that ordinariness, in remembering that beneath the legend, Kolmanskop was once just a place where people lived their small, good days, one after another, in the sun and the sand. The men, for the most part, went off to the work of the diamonds, and the diamond work, in those early years especially, was a strange and almost gentle thing compared to most mining. There were no deep shafts here, no dark tunnels, no dynamite and danger underground. The diamonds were simply lying in the sand near the surface, scattered across the desert floor. So the work was largely a matter of gathering. Crews of workers would comb across marked-out areas of the desert, sifting and sorting the sand, picking out the stones. In the very richest early days, as I said, you could find them by the handful. Later, it took more sifting and more sorting and more careful work, but still, the essence of it was simple. The desert had laid out a fortune on its surface, and the job was to pick it up. The workers who did this gathering, the hard daily labour of it, were mostly local African men and migrant labourers who lived and worked under conditions far harder and far less comfortable than the European residents in their fine houses with their daily ice. That is the other side of Kolmanskop, and we should not look away from it, even on a gentle night like this. The luxury of the town, the pianos and the swimming pool and the chandeliers, was built on the labour of men who did not share in most of it, who worked long hours sorting sand in the sun, and were watched closely and trusted little, suspected always of trying to keep back a stone or two for themselves. It was a colonial town, in a colonial age, with all the unfairness that carried. The comfort was real, but it was not shared equally, and the wealth that flowed through Kolmanskop flowed mostly in one direction, away from the people whose hands actually gathered it. That's simply the truth of the place, and it sits quietly underneath the prettier picture. But within its own world, the European town of Kolmanskop did its best to be a pleasant and even a cultured place to live. In the evenings, the Grand Hall came alive. There were concerts and theatrical performances. Touring musicians and singers brought at great expense across the sea and the sand to perform for a few hundred people in a desert. There were balls and dances, the sprung floor of the hall bouncing gently under the feet of dancers, music drifting out into the desert night. There was the bowling alley, where men rolled their games and kept their scores. There was the casino. There were dinner parties in the fine houses, with food and wine shipped in from Europe, served on good china under electric lights, while outside the windows the desert stretched away dark and silent for 100 miles in every direction. Picture one of those evenings, the day's heat fading, the sky going through its long, slow desert sunset, the colours deepening from gold to rose to violet to the deep blue of the coming night. The electric lights of the town coming on, a little island of brightness in all that dark. Music starting up in the grand hall. A piano, perhaps a small orchestra. The sound spilling out through the open doors and windows into the cooling air. The people of the town arriving in their good clothes, the dresses and the suits they had shipped from Europe, greeting one another, settling in for an evening of music or theatre or dancing. And all around this warm, bright bubble of human company and culture, the enormous, silent desert. The dunes invisible in the dark, the stars coming out in their thousands overhead, the wind moving softly over the sand. There is something almost unbearably poignant about it when you picture it now, knowing what we know. This little gathering of people making music and dancing and laughing together, holding their small, warm circle of light and life against the vast, indifferent dark, for the brief while that the diamonds allowed. It was lovely, it was real, and it was, though they did not know it, already beginning to end. And afterward, late, the evening winding down, the people would step out of the bright, warm hall into the desert night and make their way home along the sandy paths between the houses, the music fading behind them, the cool air on their faces, the tremendous sky overhead. Lamps would go out, one by one, in the windows of the town. The streets would empty, and slowly the little island of light would dim and settle into sleep, until only the stars were left burning over the quiet houses, and the wind moved softly over the sand, and the whole town lay dreaming in the dark, surrounded by 100 miles of silent desert in every direction. Night after night it happened like that, the bright gathering, and then the gentle settling into sleep, the town glowing and then dimming, and then resting, held safe in the great dark desert until the fog and the morning came again. There is no more peaceful image to carry with you than that. A small town falling asleep under enormous stars, the music done, the lamps going out, the wind singing low over the dunes. On weekends, families might take the short train ride to the coast at Luderitz to see the sea, to feel the cold spray, to walk along the shore. Or they might gather for picnics, or for swimming in that improbable pool. The children of Kolmanskop, much like the children we met on another island in another story, grew up thinking all of this was perfectly normal, because it was simply the world they knew. To them, it was ordinary to live in a bright, comfortable town in the middle of a vast desert, to have ice delivered each morning and opera in the evenings, to play among the dunes, to fall asleep to the sound of the wind moving the sand against the walls of the house. They did not know it was extraordinary. To them, it was just home. Think of those children for a moment, because there's something especially gentle in the picture. Their playground was the desert. They knew the dunes the way other children know parks and streets, knew the best slopes to run down and roll on, knew where the sand was soft and where the wind had packed it hard. They watched the fog come in each morning and learned, without anyone teaching them, to read the moods of the desert sky. They had the run of a small, safe town, where everyone knew everyone, where the worst dangers were the heat and the sand, where they could wander between the houses and the gardens and the great hall, and feel that the whole improbable place belonged to them. And at night, tucked into their beds, they fell asleep to that sound that ran underneath everything in Kolmanskop, the soft, endless sighing of the wind moving sand against the walls, a sound so constant that they likely stopped hearing it at all, the way you stop hearing a clock, until it was simply the texture of home, the lullaby of the desert town. Some of those children, grown old, remembered Kolmanskop for the rest of their long lives as a kind of lost paradise, a magical place out of time, half real and half dream. And in a way, it was exactly that. A small, bright, impossible town that existed fully for only a couple of decades, and then faded, so that the people who had been children there carried, all their lives, the memory of a place that no longer functioned as it had, a town you could not really go home to, because the home itself had been given over to the sand. There is a particular sweetness and sadness in that, in having your childhood set in a place that becomes, within your own lifetime, a ghost town and a legend. And it was, for those years, a real home, full of real lives. People were born in Kolmanskop, and people died there. People married and raised their children, and made friends and fell out and reconciled, and celebrated holidays, and went to work and came home, and sat on their verandas in the cool of the evening, watching the sun go down red and enormous over the dunes. For a couple of decades, this little improbable town hummed along, full of light and music and ice and diamonds, a small, warm bubble of human life in the great, indifferent desert. It could not last. Of course it could not. Nothing built on something as finite as a field of loose diamonds could last forever. And somewhere out beyond the bright windows, the conditions that had created Kolmanskop were already, quietly, beginning to change. But the people enjoying those good years did not know that yet, and there's no need for us to hurry them toward the ending. Let them dance a while longer in the grand hall. Let the ice arrive each morning. Let the children sleep soundly in their beds, with the desert wind sighing outside. The good years were real, and they were sweet, and they deserve to be lingered in before we let them go. Chapter 7. The People of Kolmanskop. Before we follow the year around and then watch the town fade, let me say a little more about the people themselves, the human beings who actually lived in this strange and glittering place. Because in the end, a town is not its buildings or its diamonds, but its people. And the people of Kolmanskop were a varied and interesting lot. At the top, in the grandest houses, were the managers and the officials, the men who ran the diamond operation and the company that owned it, along with their families. These were the people who enjoyed the fullest measure of the town's luxury, the fine furniture and the good wine, and the servants and the best of everything that could be shipped in. The chief men of the town lived very well indeed, as well as anyone in the colony, perhaps better, their isolation in the desert more than made up for by the comforts their position and the diamonds provided. Then there were the professionals and the skilled people who made the town work, the doctor, who ran that remarkable little hospital with its X-ray machine, the teachers at the school, the engineers who kept the power station and the ice factory and the machinery running, the shopkeepers and the bakers and the butchers, the bookkeepers and the clerks and the administrators. These were ordinary middle-class people, many of them German, living a comfortable middle-class life in an extraordinarily uncomfortable middle of nowhere, raising their families, doing their jobs, making their small contributions to the running of the town. For them, Kolmanskop was a posting, a place to live and work for a while, often a strange and memorable chapter of their lives. Each of them held the town together in their own small way. Without the engineers, the lights would go dark and the ice would melt. Without the doctor, the sick and the injured would have nowhere to turn in all that emptiness. Without the teachers, the children would grow up unschooled in the sand. Without the bakers and the shopkeepers, the daily comforts that made the place livable would simply stop. A town, even a small one, even a strange one in the middle of a desert, is a web of people quietly depending on one another, each doing their part, each trusting the others to do theirs, and Kolmanskop was no different. It worked because hundreds of people, day after day, did their jobs and kept their small corners of it running, and together, without any one of them quite seeing the whole, they made a functioning town bloom in a place that had no business supporting one. And then there were the workers, the labourers, the men who did the hard physical work of gathering and sorting the diamonds, and the cooking and cleaning and hauling and building that kept the whole place running. As I have said more than once tonight, because it matters and because it is easy to let the prettier story crowd it out, many of these workers were local African men and migrant labourers who lived under far harder conditions than the Europeans, in separate and much humbler quarters, doing the heavy work for little reward and under close watch, suspected always of trying to keep back a diamond or two. The comfortable life of the town rested on their labour, and they shared in very little of its comfort. That was the way of the colonial world in that age, unjust and unequal, and Kolmanskop was a piece of that world for all its charm. We can love the beauty of the place and find peace in its quiet ruins, while still remembering clearly and honestly that its glory was not shared by all who made it, and that the people whose hands actually gathered the diamonds were not the people who got to dance in the grand hall. Both things are true. Holding both of them is simply part of seeing the place clearly, but across all those divisions there were the ordinary human things that happen wherever people live together. There were friendships and rivalries, romances and marriages, the births of children and the deaths of the old. There were people who loved it here, and people who counted the days until they could leave. There were the lonely, far from home in a hard desert, and the content, who found in this small, bright town everything they wanted. There were people who got rich, like the railwayman August Stauck, who started it all, though even his great fortune, made and lost over the years, is its own reminder that the diamonds gave and the diamonds took away. There were people who passed through quickly, and people who stayed for the whole brief life of the town. All the ordinary human comedy and sorrow, the whole of life, played out for a few decades in this little place in the sand, under the enormous sky, far from everywhere. And then, one by one, family by family, they all left, and took their stories with them, and scattered out into the wider world, to live the rest of their lives in other, easier places, carrying the memory of the diamond town in the desert. Some wrote about it, some told their children and grandchildren. Some, no doubt, simply kept it as a private memory, a strange, bright chapter from long ago. But all of them left in the end, and the town they left behind kept none of their stories, only the shapes of the rooms where the stories had happened, slowly filling now with sand. So, as we go on to watch the town fade and the desert return, hold the people in your mind, gently. They were real. They lived full lives here, and they all found their way onward to other places and other days long ago. The town is empty now, but it was once full of them, full of voices and footsteps and music and the whole warm noise of human life. It's good to remember that before we let the silence come. And it's worth saying, too, that the memory of Kolmanskop did not simply vanish when the people did. Those who had lived there carried it with them, and many of them treasured it. In the years and decades that followed, former residents and their descendants would sometimes return to visit the old town, to walk through the houses where they or their parents had once lived, to stand in the rooms now filling with sand, and remember the parties and the music, and the gardens and the ice. There were reunions, gatherings of people who had shared that strange, bright chapter of life in the desert. For them, the ghost town was not a curiosity or a spooky ruin, but something far more tender, a lost home, a vanished world that they alone could still see clearly beneath the drifting sand, peopling the empty rooms again in their memories with the faces and voices of long ago. Slowly, of course, as is the way of things, those people grew old and passed on in their turn, until there was almost no one left who actually remembered the living town. Only the photographs and the records and the stories handed down. But for a good long while, Kolmanskop lived on in the memories of the people who had loved it, even as the sand quietly buried the place itself. There is something gentle in that, a kind of overlap, where the physical town was emptying and filling with sand at the very same time that it remained vivid and whole and full of life in the minds of the people scattered out across the world who had once called it home. The desert took the buildings, but for as long as they lived, the people kept the town, the real town, the warm and living one, safe inside themselves. And now that they too are gone, we keep it, a little, you and I, tonight, having walked through its whole story together. The living town exists now only in remembering, and so, in remembering it gently, we give it a kind of quiet afterlife, one more soft place for it to rest. Chapter 8. A Year in the Desert Town. Let me give you one more gentle wander through the life of Kolmanskop in its good years, this time across the turning of a whole year, because the rhythm of the seasons here was its own quiet thing, and there's no sweeter way to drift towards sleep than to follow a year around in a peaceful place. The desert does not have seasons the way greener lands do. There is no spring bursting into bloom, no autumn of falling leaves, no deep, snowbound winter. The changes here are subtler, written in the temperature and the wind and the fog and the angle of the light. But they are real, and the people of Kolmanskop lived by them, as people everywhere live by the turning of their year. In the cooler months, the desert was kinder. The fierce heat of midsummer eased, and the days were warm and bright and pleasant rather than blazing, and the nights grew cold. Cold enough for a fire, cold enough to pull the blankets close. This was the comfortable time, the time when the gardens did best, when sitting out on the veranda in the evening was a pleasure rather than an endurance, when the town felt most at ease in its hard setting. The light in these months was long and golden and soft, slanting low across the dunes, and the famous fog came often in the mornings, rolling in thick off the cold sea. These were the months people must have loved best, when the desert relaxed its grip and let the town simply be comfortable. Imagine a cool evening in that gentle season, sitting out on a veranda as the sun went down, a blanket perhaps over the knees as the night came on, the sand still holding a little of the day's warmth, the sky doing its slow, magnificent fade from gold to rose to violet to star-pricked black. The day's work done, the evening meal eaten, the children settling toward bed, and nothing to do but sit and watch the desert darken and feel the cool air come, and listen to the soft sounds of the town winding down towards sleep around you. A door closing somewhere, a voice, a snatch of music, and underneath it all, the endless, soft sigh of the wind on the sand. It is the kind of evening that asks nothing of you, that simply lets you be still and watch the day end. The kind of deep, ordinary peace that is one of the quiet gifts of life in a remote and beautiful place. In the hotter months, the desert showed more of its teeth. The sun climbed high and fierce, and the sand grew too hot to touch by midday, and the heat lay over the town like a weight. This was when the daily ice mattered most, when the shaded rooms and the swept verandas and the cool of the evening were most precious. People rose early, before the worst of the heat, and rested through the blazing middle of the day, and came alive again as the sun sank and the air cooled. The desert in high summer demanded respect, demanded that you arrange your life around its heat, and the people did, and in return it gave them those enormous, brilliant evenings, the sun going down like a slow red fire over the dunes, the heat draining out of the air, the stars coming out in their tremendous numbers. There is an old wisdom in living that way, in bending your day around the sun rather than fighting it, and the people of Kolmanskop learned it the way people in hot lands everywhere have always learned it. The cool early morning for work and errands, while the air was still soft and the light still gentle. The blazing middle of the day for rest, for shade, for stillness, for waiting out the heat behind thick walls and closed shutters. The whole town going quiet and slow through the worst of it. And then the long, golden relief of the evening, when the sun finally let go of the sky and the cool came flooding back, and the town stirred and woke and came together again. It is a gentler, older rhythm than the one most of us keep now, a rhythm set by the sun and the heat rather than the clock, and there is something restful in it, even to imagine. The deep midday hush of a desert town drowsing through the heat, waiting for the cool of the evening to come. And through all the months, the great constants. The fog in the mornings, more in some seasons than others, but always a part of life. The wind, shifting with the seasons but never truly stopping, always moving the sand. The cold sea off to the west, unchanging. The enormous sky. The slow wheel of the stars at night. The constellations of the southern hemisphere turning overhead. The bright band of the Milky Way arching across the dark in a way that people from the cities of the world can scarcely imagine. So thick and bright and close that it seems you could almost reach up and touch it. Imagine standing outside one of the houses on a clear, cool night in Kolmanskop, in the good years, with the music drifting faint from the hall behind you, and the lamp-lit windows of the town glowing warm, and then turning to face the desert and looking up. The sky out here, with no city light for hundreds of miles to dim it, would have been almost overwhelming, a blaze of stars from horizon to horizon, the great river of the Milky Way pouring across it, the southern constellations that northern visitors had never seen wheeling slowly overhead. People who live under such skies often say it gives them a particular feeling, a smallness that is not frightening but somehow comforting, the sense of being one tiny warm life beneath an enormous and ancient and beautiful sky. The people of Kolmanskop had that sky over them every clear night of their lives here, a free wonder thrown in atop all the bought ones, the diamonds in the sand below, and the diamonds in the sky above, and the little glowing town in between. The town marked its human seasons too, the holidays and the festivals brought from Europe, celebrated in the desert with whatever could be shipped in to make them feel like home. Christmas in the heat of the southern summer, the strange, sweet displacement of singing northern carols about snow while the desert blazed outside. Birthdays and weddings and anniversaries, the arrival of a touring performer as an event to look forward to for weeks. The ordinary human calendar of a small, close community, its gatherings and its rituals, playing out year after year in this most unlikely of places. There is something touching in those transplanted celebrations, those people keeping the customs of a faraway homeland in a place so utterly unlike it. The Christmas trees, if they had them, would have been shipped in or improvised, the festive foods carried across the sea, the familiar songs sung under a blazing summer sky in a desert where it had perhaps never rained in living memory, let alone snowed. It was a way of holding on to who they were, of staying connected to the world they had come from, of making this strange outpost in the sand feel, for a day or an evening, like home. And the children who grew up there would have known no other way of marking the seasons, would have thought it perfectly normal to celebrate a midwinter festival in the middle of a desert summer, would have carried those particular memories, the carols and the heat together for the rest of their lives. Every community, however remote, builds its own calendar of small joys to look forward to, its own rhythm of gatherings that break up the year and give it shape. And Kolmanskop was no different, marking its time with music and feasts and festivals in the heart of the silent desert. It was a good life in its way for those who shared in its comforts, a life with a gentle rhythm to it, the daily round of ice and bread and work and evening, the weekly round of rest and church and the trip to the sea, the yearly round of the seasons and the holidays, all of it set against the vast, unchanging backdrop of the desert and the stars. For a couple of decades, that rhythm held, steady and sweet, the heartbeat of a small, warm town in a great, empty land. And the people living it had every reason to think it would go on, that their children would grow up here and their grandchildren after them, that Kolmanskop would simply continue, ice and music and diamonds, world without end. But the diamonds, as we know, had other plans, or rather, the diamonds had no plans at all, which was exactly the problem. Let's turn now, gently, to the long, slow fading of the town, Chapter 9. The Diamonds Move On. Every boom carries the seed of its own ending, and Kolmanskop was no exception. The very thing that made the town, the astonishing richness of the diamonds lying in the sand right there, was also, in time, the thing that doomed it. Because a field of loose surface diamonds, however rich, is not endless. You gather, and the easy stones grow fewer, and you have to work harder and sift more sand to find the same wealth. And slowly, year by year, the richest ground is worked out. That alone might have been survivable, but two larger things were happening out beyond Kolmanskop that together would seal its fate. The first was simply that even richer diamond deposits were discovered elsewhere along the same coast, farther to the south, down toward the mouth of the Great Orange River, where it empties into the sea after its long journey across southern Africa. It turned out that the river had been carrying diamonds down from the interior for ages and depositing them along the coast, and that the deposits near the river mouth were even larger and even richer than those around Kolmanskop. In 1928, these new and spectacular fields to the south were discovered, and the whole centre of gravity of the diamond industry began, slowly but surely, to shift in that direction. Why keep working the thinning fields around Kolmanskop when there were richer ones to be had elsewhere? The companies, the money, and the attention began to move south, toward the new fields and the new town of Arrangement that grew up to serve them. It's worth pausing on the quiet cruelty of that, though there was nothing personal in it. Kolmanskop had done nothing wrong. Its people had not failed. The town was as comfortable and as well run and as full of life as it had ever been. It was simply that the diamonds, the entire reason for its existence, were running thinner here while richer ones beckoned elsewhere, and in the cold arithmetic of the industry, that was that. A town that exists for one reason and one reason only lives entirely at the mercy of that reason. When the diamonds around Kolmanskop were the richest in the land, the town had everything. When richer diamonds were found a little farther south, the town's fate was sealed, regardless of how pleasant a place it was to live, regardless of how much its people loved it. The desert had given Kolmanskop its brief glory on a kind of loan, and now, gently, the loan was being called in. The second thing was the wider world. The years around 1930 brought the Great Depression, the global economic collapse that threw the whole world into hardship. And in hard times, the price of diamonds, which are, after all, a luxury, a thing people buy when they feel rich and confident, falls. Demand dropped. The diamond business, everywhere, grew leaner and more cautious. A remote desert town that was already past its richest days, in an industry that was tightening its belt and looking south to better ground, was exactly the kind of place that would be quietly wound down. It's worth seeing how those two forces worked together, because between them they sealed the town's fate as surely as any disaster could have, only far more gently. The diamonds nearby were thinning, while richer ones beckoned to the south. And at the very same time, the whole world's appetite for diamonds was shrinking in the grip of hard times. So Kolmanskop was squeezed from both sides at once, its own ground giving less, and the world wanting less of what that ground gave. There was no villain in this, no single decision, no cruelty. It was simply economics, the vast, impersonal arithmetic of supply and demand, and where the money could best be spent, working itself out across a desert and a decade, and arriving, without any malice at all, at the quiet conclusion that this particular bright little town had served its purpose and could now be let go. And so it was. The decline of Kolmanskop was not sudden. There was no single dramatic day, no disaster, no catastrophe. It was a slow leaking away, a gradual fading, the opposite of the explosive rush that had created the place. Families began to leave, a few at a time, transferred to the richer fields in the south, or simply moving on to wherever the work and the life were better now. As people left, the things that needed people to run them began to close. There were fewer children, so the school shrank. There was less custom, so the shops did less business. The concerts grew rarer. The grand hall fell quiet more often than not. The swimming pool was used less, and the gardens were tended by fewer hands, and the daily ice was delivered to fewer doors. Year by year through the 1930s, Kolmanskop emptied, gently, quietly, like a tide going out. It's a strange and almost peaceful kind of ending when you think about it, very different from the violent ends that befall some places. No one was driven out. Nothing terrible happened. People simply, one household at a time, decided that the time had come to go and packed up what they wanted to keep and left, and did not come back. The town did not die in a single night. It faded, the way an evening fades, slowly losing its light. There must have been so many small last moments woven into that long fading, though no one marked them as they passed. The last concert ever held in the grand hall, the musicians packing up their instruments, the audience drifting home, none of them knowing it was the last. The last game bowled in the bowling alley, the last block of ice delivered to the last occupied house, the last child to be born in the town, the last wedding, the last party, the last family to load their belongings onto the train and ride away toward the coast, looking back, perhaps, at the houses standing quiet in the sand. Each of these was a small ending, unremarked, simply part of the slow leaking away of a place that was winding down. And somewhere in there was the very last morning that anyone swept the sand from a Kolmanskop veranda. The last time a human hand pushed back the desert, before the desert was finally, permanently, left to do as it pleased. By the 1940s, Kolmanskop was a shadow of what it had been, just a small remnant of people in a town built for many more. The hospital, with its famous X-ray machine, eventually closed, and finally, in 1956, the last few residents packed their things and left for good. And Kolmanskop, after only about half a century of life, was given over entirely to the desert. The doors were left unlocked, or simply left. The fine furniture, the heavy pieces not worth the cost of shipping away, were often left behind in the houses. The town was not destroyed, not torn down, not burned. It was simply abandoned, walked away from, left standing whole and quiet in the sand, with the wind already beginning, patiently, to do what the wind does. There is a particular poignancy in a place left like this, not ruined but simply abandoned, still furnished, still whole, just empty. The people took what mattered most and what was easy to carry, and left the rest where it stood. A heavy wardrobe too cumbersome to ship, a bathtub, shelves and counters in the shops, fittings and fixtures, the bones of dozens of households left behind in place, as though the people had only stepped out for a moment and might come back at any time. But they did not come back. They never came back. And so the town stood there, furnished and empty, waiting for residents who would never return, while the only thing that did keep coming, faithfully, day after day, year after year, was the sand. And what the wind does, out here, is bring the sand. With no one left to sweep the verandas and clear the doorways and fight the daily war against the dunes, the sand was finally free to go wherever it pleased. And where it pleased to go was into the town, into the houses, through the doors and the windows and across the floors, drifting and piling and rising year after year, claiming the bright little diamond town grain by patient grain. Let's watch it happen, slowly, in the next part of our night. It's one of the most beautiful slow disappearances anywhere on Earth. Chapter 10. The Sand Comes In. Here is where the story of Kolmanskop becomes something rare and quietly beautiful. because the way this town is disappearing is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. Most abandoned places are reclaimed by green, by vines and trees and moss, by water and growing things. Kolmanskop is being reclaimed by sand. The desert that the town held back for 50 years, with all its sweeping and its effort, is simply walking back in through the open doors, and it has all the time in the world. It happens slowly, of course, the way everything happens in the desert. The wind blows, as it has always blown, off the sea and across the dunes, and it carries the sand. While people lived here, that sand was a daily nuisance to be cleared away, swept off, shoveled out, fought back. But the moment the people left, the fight was over, and the sand simply began to accumulate. It blew up against the walls of the houses and piled there. It sifted in through the gaps around the doors and windows. It came in through any opening it could find, a broken pane, an unlatched shutter, a door left ajar. And once inside, with nothing to stop it, it began to settle and gather on the floors. It's worth dwelling on how patient this process is, because patience is the whole character of the desert and the whole mood of this part of the story. The sand does not rush in like a flood. It does not arrive all at once. It comes a little at a time, on the wind, grain by grain by grain, the way it has moved across this desert for millions of years. A windy day adds a thin new layer to the drift in a corner. A windy season builds it higher. A windy decade fills a room. There is no drama in it, no violence, no single moment when the sand takes a house. There is only the slow, ceaseless, utterly patient accumulation, the desert doing what the desert does, with all the time in the world and no reason at all to hurry. The people fought this patience for 50 years and held it back. The moment they stopped, the patience simply resumed, and it has been winning gently ever since, and it will go on winning gently for as long as the wind blows and the sand moves, which is to say, forever. And then it kept coming. Year after year, decade after decade, the sand poured in, a little more each season, drifting across the floorboards, climbing the walls, filling the rooms from the bottom up. In house after house in Kolmanskop, you can now walk through a doorway and find a room half full of sand, a great smooth golden dune flowing in through the window and spreading across the floor, rising sometimes halfway up the walls, sometimes higher, sometimes nearly to the ceiling. The sand pours down staircases like slow water frozen in place. It fills doorways so that you have to climb over a drift to pass from one room to the next. It laps against the old wallpaper, faded now to soft pinks and blues and greens, peeling gently away from the plaster. It pools in the corners of grand rooms where pianos once played. Each room is its own small composition, shaped by the particular way the wind happens to reach it, the position of its window, the direction it faces, the openings the sand has found. In one room, the sand might form a single, perfect, smooth slope, rising from the doorway to the far wall, like a beach with no sea. In another, it might pile in a great heap beneath a window, where the wind has poured it in for decades. In another, it might lie shallow and rippled across the whole floor, marked with the delicate patterns the wind leaves on all open sand. And the colours play against each other endlessly, the warm gold of the sand against the cool faded blue or green or pink of a wall, the bright light from a glassless window against the soft shadow of a corner. No two rooms are the same. No single room stays the same either, because the sand keeps moving, slowly, so that the shapes shift and grow over the years. A sculpture the wind is always patiently reworking, never finishing, never meaning anything by it, simply doing what the wind does with sand. It is a strange and dreamlike thing to see, and people travel from all over the world to see it, because there is nothing else quite like it. A room with a real floor and real walls and a real window and pale daylight coming through and a great tongue of desert sand flowing in and across and through, as if the room were slowly drowning in slow motion, in gold. The light in these rooms is extraordinary, soft and warm, the sun coming through the empty windows and falling on the rippled surface of the sand and the peeling coloured walls, so that the whole scene glows. Photographers love Kolmanskop more than almost any abandoned place on Earth because of exactly this, the way the desert light and the flowing sand and the old coloured rooms come together into something that looks less like decay than like a kind of slow, beautiful dream. There is a particular quiet inside those sand-filled rooms that people who have stood in them struggle to describe. It is the quiet of a place where time has slowed almost to a stop. The sand does not rush. It has taken decades to fill these rooms, and it will take decades more to fill them further. And standing inside one, you are standing inside a process so slow that it feels like stillness, even though it is, very gently, always moving. A little sand sifts down. A grain or two shifts in the breeze from the window. The light moves across the wall as the sun crosses the sky. Otherwise, nothing. No sound but the wind outside and the enormous silence of the desert. It is the kind of place that quiets the mind without your deciding to be quiet, that slows the breath and softens the thoughts, simply by being so still and so patient, and so far outside the hurry of the ordinary world. People come for the photographs, but many of them stay, just for a while, just to stand in that golden stillness and feel something in themselves settle. The houses themselves have held up remarkably well, because the desert, for all that it buries things, also preserves them. There is so little moisture here, so little rain, that wood does not rot the way it would in a wetter place, and metal rusts only slowly, and things simply dry out and endure. So the bones of the town remain. The houses still stand, their roofs mostly intact, their walls solid. You can still see the fine architecture, the German style, the careful craftsmanship. You can still read the shapes of the rooms and imagine the lives in them. The grand hall still stands, its stage still there, the space where music played still holding its shape. The old hospital, the shops, the manager's house, all still standing in the sand, weathered and faded and half buried, but there, recognisable, real. This is one of the quiet wonders of Kolmanskop, and it sets it apart from most ruins in the world. In a wetter climate, an abandoned town is devoured quickly. Rain gets into the roofs and the walls, wood rots, plaster falls, metal rusts to nothing, and within a few decades, green growth tears the buildings apart and pulls them down into the earth. We saw something like that on our island in another story, the forest swallowing the brick. But here, in the dry desert, decay moves at a different pace, slow and gentle. The buildings are not being torn apart, they are being preserved, even as they are being buried, dried out, and held almost intact by the same desert that fills them with sand. And so, Kolmanskop is that rare thing, a ghost town you can still read clearly, where the past is not erased but held, faded and softened, but legible, like an old photograph left in the sun. You can still walk into a room and know it was a parlour, a kitchen, a child's bedroom. You can still see the colours people chose for their walls. The desert has buried the town, but it has also, strangely, kept it, the way a thing kept in a dry attic stays whole for generations, while a thing left in a damp cellar crumbles away. It is, in a way, the gentlest possible kind of ruin. Nothing violent has happened here. No fire, no flood, no collapse, no war. Just the patient return of the sand, flowing in through the doors of a town that has no more need of doors, filling the rooms of a town that has no more need of rooms, taking back, grain by grain, with no hurry and no malice, the small, bright bubble of human life that briefly bloomed here and then gently let go. The desert is not destroying Kolmanskop, it is simply absorbing it, folding it back into itself, the way it has folded so many things back into itself over its millions of patient years. That gentleness is worth pausing on, because it's so much of why this place soothes rather than disturbs. Many ruins carry an air of violence or tragedy, a sense of something terrible having happened, and standing in them can leave you uneasy. But there is none of that at Kolmanskop. Nothing bad happened here. No catastrophe emptied the town. It was simply outlived by the diamonds, and gently left, and gently reclaimed. And so to stand in its sand-filled rooms is not unsettling at all. It is peaceful. It feels less like a place where something was lost than like a place where something was set down, carefully, and allowed to rest. The desert has been kind to Kolmanskop in its slow, impersonal way. It has not torn the town apart. It has tucked it in, drawn the sand up over it like a blanket, grain by grain, and let it sleep. And the town does seem to sleep more than anything else. That's the word that comes to people again and again when they try to describe it. Not dead, not haunted, sleeping. A whole little town lying down at last in the desert that made it and unmade it, pulling the warm sand over itself and sleeping deeply and peacefully in the golden light, with the wind singing softly over the dunes outside. There are far worse things for a place to become. There are far worse ways for a story to end. Chapter 11. Kolmanskop. Today. So what is Kolmanskop now, in our own time? It is a ghost town, certainly, one of the most famous and most photographed in the world, but it is not a forgotten or forbidden one, not anymore. And that is part of what makes its ending so gentle. For a long time, remember, this whole stretch of desert was the Sperrgebiet, the forbidden zone, sealed off because of the diamonds. And in a sense, it still is. The diamond mining moved south, but it never stopped, and vast areas of this coast remain restricted, controlled, off-limits, watched over because of the wealth that still lies in the sand. You cannot simply wander freely across this desert even today. Much of it remains exactly what it has been for over 100 years, a guarded and forbidden territory. So Kolmanskop sits, even now, on the edge of a great forbidden emptiness, a small opened door in a vast closed region. Step out of the town in most directions, and you would soon find yourself at the boundary of land where you are not permitted to go. The same locked desert that has been locked for more than a century. Still kept empty, still kept wild, still guarding its scattered diamonds behind its line on the map. There is something fitting in that this little ghost town, once itself at the heart of the Forbidden Zone, now serves as almost the only place within it that ordinary people are invited to see. A single window onto a sealed and secret stretch of the earth. Beyond Kolmanskop, the old prohibition still holds. The desert still keeps its diamonds and its silence, and the gates are still, for the most part, closed. But Kolmanskop itself, the old town, has been opened up. It sits close enough to the port town of Luderitz that it could be made reachable, and at some point those who managed the area realised that this strange, beautiful, half-buried town was a treasure of a different kind, a place people would want to come and see. And so Kolmanskop became a destination. Today you can buy a permit and visit it. Guides will walk you through its history. The most important buildings, the Grand Hall, the shop, a few of the houses, have been restored or maintained, kept up as a small museum so that visitors can see how the town looked in its glory, can see the bowling alley and the hall, and imagine the music and the ice and the light. And then you can wander out among the other houses, the ones left to the sand, and walk through those dreamlike rooms half drowned in gold, and stand in the soft desert light and feel the deep quiet of the place. It draws photographers especially, from all over the world, who come for that famous light and those famous sand-filled rooms, and who have made Kolmanskop one of the most recognisable abandoned places anywhere, its images known to people who have never heard its name or its history. You have very likely seen a photograph of Kolmanskop at some point, even if you did not know what it was. A room with sand flowing through the window, glowing in warm light. That is this place. That is the little diamond town in the Namib, slowly returning to the desert. The best time to visit, the people who know it say, is the early morning, just after the gates open, when the light is low and soft and golden and slanting in through the eastern windows, and the air is still cool, and the day's visitors have not yet arrived in numbers. In that early light, alone or nearly alone in one of the old houses, with the sand glowing and the silence enormous, Kolmanskop is said to be one of the most peaceful and beautiful places a person can stand. The fog sometimes still rolls in off the sea in the mornings, just as it did when the town was alive, drifting over the dunes and the roofs, softening everything, and then lifting and burning away to reveal the bright sand and the blue sky and the quiet houses, exactly as it has done for 100 years and more. Nearby, the old port town of Luderitz still stands on its lonely stretch of coast, still clinging to the edge of the continent where the cold sea meets the desert. It is a real, living town, small and remote, with its own German colonial buildings and its own hard beauty. And it serves now as the gateway for the people who come to see Kolmanskop. From Luderitz, it is only a short drive out into the desert to the ghost town, a journey that once carried diamonds and pianos and opera singers, and is now travelled by visitors with cameras, come to see what the desert has made of the place. The two towns, the living one and the ghost, sit there together on that wild coast at the edge of the great forbidden desert, much as they have for over a century. And there is something fitting and something peaceful about how it has ended up. A place born from one of the great rushes of greed and luck and sudden wealth, a place of diamonds and chandeliers and improbable luxury, has become, in the end, a quiet place that people travel to not for riches, but simply for its beauty and its stillness. The diamonds are gone, gathered up and carried away and scattered into the world a century ago. What is left is the thing that has no price at all. The quiet, the light, the slow flowing sand, the gentle dignity of a place at rest. The desert took back the town, but in doing so, it made something lovelier than the town had ever quite been. Something calm and dreamlike and strangely soothing. A ruin that doesn't frighten, but simply settles the heart. People who visit often say they did not expect to feel the way they feel there. They came for the famous photographs, for the novelty of the sand-filled rooms, expecting, perhaps, a curiosity, a quirky stop, a few good pictures. And instead, they found themselves slowing down, growing quiet, lingering in the glowing rooms longer than they meant to, reluctant to leave. There is something about the place that works on people, that settles and softens them. The same thing we have been circling all night. The deep peace of somewhere that has finished with all its striving, that wants nothing, fears nothing, hurries toward nothing, that simply rests in the light with the sand flowing slowly through it. In a world that is always rushing, always wanting, always anxious, a place that has completely let go of all of that can feel almost like medicine. People come for the photographs and leave with something quieter, a little of Kolmanskop's stillness carried home inside them. And that, perhaps, is the truest thing the old diamond town has to offer now, long after its diamonds and its luxury have scattered to the winds. Not riches, but rest. Not glitter, but peace. The most valuable thing in Kolmanskop today is the very thing that has no market price at all. The deep, golden quiet that fills its rooms, along with the sand. Chapter 12. What the Desert Keeps. Before we go back out into the desert one last time to say goodnight, let me sit with you a while longer in the quiet and think about what this little town has to tell us, because there's something in its story that settles the heart if you let it. Kolmanskop is, on the surface, a story about diamonds, about sudden wealth, about one of the great lucky strikes in human history. People crawling across the sand gathering fortunes by moonlight. A town of ice and chandeliers and opera blooming in a waterless desert. It sounds like a story about riches, and yet the thing that lingers, the thing that draws people from all over the world and quiets them when they arrive, is not the wealth at all. The diamonds are gone. They were gathered up and carried away and scattered into rings and necklaces all over the world more than a lifetime ago. And no one who visits Kolmanskop now is thinking about diamonds. What remains, what moves people, is the opposite of all that frantic wealth. It is the stillness, the light, the slow flowing sand, the deep peace of a place that has stopped wanting anything. Think of where those diamonds went. Each one gathered from the sand here was cut and polished and set into something. A ring slipped onto a finger, a necklace clasped at a throat, a brooch pinned to a coat, and carried off into the wide world, into cities and homes and lives scattered across every continent. Somewhere out there, even now, are diamonds that once lay in the sand around Kolmanskop, gleaming on the hands of people who have never heard the town's name and never will, who have no idea that the bright stone they treasure came from a little ghost town slowly filling with sand in the Namib Desert. The wealth of Kolmanskop did not vanish. It simply dispersed, scattered into 1,000 fragments across the world, each one carrying off a tiny piece of this place to shine in some distant life. And the town that gathered all that brilliance kept none of it. It gave every diamond away and was left with only the sand and the silence and the light, which, as it turns out, may be the better inheritance. There's a kind of lesson in that, gentle and not at all preachy, just quietly there in the sand. Everything the town chased so hard, the diamonds, the luxury, the comfort wrestled out of the desert at enormous cost, all of it passed away within a single human lifetime. The pianos fell silent, the ice stopped coming, the gardens died, the people left. And what the desert made of the place afterward, asking for nothing, hurrying for nothing, is more beautiful and more peaceful than the busy, glittering town ever was. The sand flowing through the rooms in the golden light is lovelier than any chandelier. The silence is sweeter than any concert. The town spent itself in a brief, bright rush, and then the desert, patient and unhurried, made something quietly perfect out of what was left behind. It's the kind of thought that can either trouble a person or comfort them, depending on how you hold it. And tonight, let's hold it the comforting way. Because yes, it's true that all the striving passed, that the wealth scattered, that the bright town faded within a lifetime. But that isn't really a sad thing, not when you look at it gently. It's simply the way of things, the way of every town and every life and every bright endeavour. Things rise and shine for their season, and then are gently let go, and something quiet and peaceful takes their place. There's no tragedy in it. There's almost a kindness in it. The desert did not punish Kolmanskop for its brief, glittering pride. It simply, when the time came, took the town back into its great calm, the way it takes everything back eventually. and made of it something restful and lovely, and asked nothing in return. And there is a freedom in remembering that, especially in the quiet of the night, when the mind sometimes turns to all the things it is chasing and worrying over and trying to hold on to. The diamonds of Kolmanskop were the most valuable things in the world to the people who gathered them, and they are gone, scattered, forgotten, and the town does not miss them at all. What remains, what matters now, what draws people across the world and quiets their hearts when they arrive, is the thing that was always free and always there underneath. The stillness, the light, the peace. You don't have to chase that. You don't have to gather it or guard it or fear losing it. It's simply there, in the quiet, available to anyone who grows still enough to feel it, the way Kolmanskop is still now, the way you are growing still now. And there is no sadness in it, not really, or only the soft kind that is almost a comfort. Nothing terrible happened at Kolmanskop. No disaster, no tragedy, no horror. A town was born from a stroke of luck, lived a short, glittering life, and then was gently let go. Its people moving on to live out their days elsewhere, its buildings left standing in the sand to be slowly, beautifully reclaimed. It is one of the most peaceful endings any place has ever had. The town did not suffer. The people did not suffer. They simply moved on the way people do. And the desert simply moved back in, the way the desert does. And the result is this quiet, golden dream of a place that asks nothing of anyone and offers, to those who come, only stillness and light. That is what the desert keeps, not the diamonds which it gave away, not the wealth which scattered to the winds. It keeps the quiet. It keeps the light. It keeps the slow, patient beauty of a place at rest. And tonight, as you lie here drifting towards sleep, you can keep a little of it too. That feeling of a place where there is nothing left to chase, nothing left to fear, nothing left to do but rest in the golden stillness, while the sand flows soft and slow and the wind sighs over the dunes. Chapter 13. The Town and the Desert. Tonight. So let's end the way we began, out in the great desert, in the quiet. Only now we know the town that sleeps there, and we can look at it with gentle, knowing eyes. Picture Kolmanskop right now, tonight, as you lie here. The desert is dark and enormous all around it. The dunes rolling away for 100 miles under the stars, and the stars themselves are something to behold out here, far from any city light, the whole vast, brilliant sweep of them, thick and bright and silent over the sand. The cold sea is off to the west, breaking on its lonely shore. And in the middle of all that darkness and space sits the little town, the houses standing quietly in the sand, pale shapes in the starlight, their windows dark and empty, the desert flowing slowly through them. It is hard to describe how dark and how quiet a desert night truly is, for those of us used to the glow and hum of inhabited places. There are no streetlights here, no headlights, no distant city glow on the horizon, no sound of traffic or machinery or voices. There is only the enormous dark, and in it the stars, more stars than most people ever see in their lives, the whole sky crowded and blazing with them, the Milky Way a bright river arching overhead. And there is only the silence, broken by nothing but the soft voice of the wind moving over the sand. It is the kind of dark and the kind of quiet that the human race knew for almost all of its history, before we lit up the night. The deep, old dark that our distant ancestors slept beneath, and there is something in us, perhaps, that remembers it, that finds it not frightening but profoundly restful, the way a child is rested by being held. The desert night holds the little town like that, in the deep, old dark, under the blazing stars, in the enormous silence. The wind is moving the way it always moves here. The same wind that carried the sand to bury the town. The same wind that has blown across this desert for millions of years. It sighs around the corners of the empty houses. It hisses softly over the dunes. It lifts a little sand and carries it and sets it down again. The endless, patient work, going on tonight as it goes on every night, grain by grain by grain. Inside the houses, the sand lies in its smooth golden drifts, cool now in the desert night, holding the shapes the wind has given it. The grand hall stands silent where the music used to play. The old rooms hold their peeling coloured walls and their flowing sand and their deep, deep quiet. There is no one to be afraid of out there. There is nothing troubling on the desert wind. Everyone who lived in Kolmanskop, everyone who danced in the hall and gathered the diamonds and grew the gardens and delivered the ice and raised their children in the sand, has long since moved on, lived out their lives elsewhere and gone to their rest. The town did not end in pain. It ended in a slow, gentle leaving, a quiet packing up and moving on. And there is no sorrow left in it now, only stillness, only the soft sound of the wind and the patient flowing of the sand, and the enormous peace of the desert night. If you could walk through the sleeping town tonight, you would find nothing in it to fear, only quiet rooms full of cool sand and soft starlight. Here is the grand hall where the music played, silent now, its stage empty, the sand drifted across the floor where the dancers once turned. Here is a house where a family lived, its rooms half filled with smooth golden dunes, its walls still holding the faded colours someone chose with care 100 years ago. Here is the old shop, the old hospital, the manager's grand house, all of them standing quiet in the dark, all of them at peace. You could walk from room to room, from house to house, through the whole sleeping town and find nothing but stillness and sand and the gentle dark, and the feeling growing in you as you walked that this is a place that has finally, completely come to rest, and that wishes you nothing but the same. And the town simply rests there, as it has rested for all these years, asking nothing of anyone, holding nothing but its own quiet memory and its slow filling with sand. The diamonds that made it are scattered across the world. The people who loved it are gone. And the place itself has been given back to the oldest, calmest thing in this whole story. The desert that was here long before the town and will be here long after. The desert that is in no hurry, that cannot be hurried, that simply blows its wind and moves its sand and waits, patient and golden and at peace. You don't have to hold any of it anymore. You don't have to stay awake to keep the story going. The wind will keep moving the sand whether or not you are awake to hear it. The stars will keep wheeling over the desert. The sand will keep flowing ever so slowly through the quiet rooms. And the town will keep sleeping its long, peaceful sleep in the middle of the great Namib, exactly as it will tomorrow, and the day after, and for a long, long time to come. Let me leave you with the gentlest picture I can to carry down into sleep. It is the very last of the night out at Kolmanskop, the hour before dawn. The desert is at its coldest and stillest now, the stars beginning just barely to fade in the east. The houses stand pale and quiet in the last of the starlight, their rooms full of cool, smooth sand, their windows dark. And then, slowly, the sky begins to lighten. the faintest grey-blue along the horizon, and the fog comes creeping in off the sea, soft and silent, filling the low places between the dunes, drifting over the rooftops of the sleeping town, beading gently on the old walls. Everything goes soft and dim and gentle inside the fog, and the town simply rests there, wrapped in mist, in the blue hour before the sun, as peaceful as anything has ever been, while the desert holds it close, and the wind sighs low over the dunes, and the new day waits, unhurried, to arrive. There is no one there to see it. There hasn't been for a long time. The dawn comes up over Kolmanskop alone, the way it has come up thousands of times since the people left, the fog lifting and the light spreading gold across the sand and into the quiet rooms, and no one to watch it but the desert itself. And that is exactly as it should be. The town does not need anyone anymore. It has everything it needs. It has the sand and the light and the silence and the deep, deep peace of a place that is finally, completely at rest. So let it all go now. Let the desert drift away into the dark. Let your breathing slow. Let the warm sand and the soft light and the sighing wind carry you down. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest, the way Kolmanskop is resting, out there in the quiet sand, peaceful at last, after its short and glittering life. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The story is told, the whole of it, from the empty desert before the town, to the gleam of the first diamond in the sand, to the bright, brief years of music and ice and light, to the slow, gentle fading, to the patient return of the sand, all the way to the quiet, golden town that sleeps in the desert tonight. You have come the whole way through it, and now you can set it down, the way the people set down the town, and let yourself be carried off into the dark and the quiet, as gently as the sand drifting through an open window. The wind will keep blowing, the sand will keep flowing, slow and soft through the silent rooms. The stars will keep wheeling over the dunes, and the little town will keep its long, peaceful sleep in the heart of the great old desert, asking nothing, fearing nothing, at rest, while you drift down into your own rest now, warm and safe and far from every trouble in the world. Sleep well. The town is at peace, and so can you be. Good night.